Hi. A quick warning. The episode you are about to hear contains very strong adult themes compared to the rest of our podcast series, as well as strong language and cursing, which has not been censored in order to preserve the original story as it was told. The episode also contains content that may be offensive from an Islamic or religious standpoint, similarly to our other episodes covering sensitive subjects, including the ex-Muslim series with Ali Rizvi. I'd like to state that by broadcasting this episode, our intent is not to support or agree with the actions and choices made by the characters in the story, although we do recognize their rights to make those choices, but to continue our goal of sharing as many Pakistani voices and stories from around the world as possible. These are real voices telling real stories, and our job is to share them. So if this does not sound like your cup of chai, we recommend you skip this one. Otherwise, buckle up, because this one is quite a ride. Introducing Hina Husain. She is a Pakistani Canadian.
So my name's Hina. I am 32 years old. I was born and raised in Lahore, Pakistan. I was born in Model Town, but I lived most of my life in defense.
Hina is here today to tell us a major story of her life and open up to us. We'll get to the story in a few minutes, but first, let's get to know her a little bit better. Also, let's play a small side game. Over the next 5 minutes, Hina will mention 8 different places that she has either lived at or visited. See if you can catch all of them. That's 8 places.
And I moved out of Pakistan with my family when I was 15. We moved to Indonesia in Southeast Asia. I was there for 2 years. And then when I was 17, my family and I moved to Mississauga, which is a suburb of Toronto in Canada. And I've lived in Canada ever since.
So you were 17 when you moved to Canada?
Yeah, I was 17 when I moved here. Yep.
Do you speak Urdu?
I speak very good Urdu actually. मेरी उर्दू बहुत अच्छी है और मैं उर्दू में बात कर भी सकती हूँ और मैं अपने बेटे के साथ उर्दू में बात करती हूँ ताकि उसके उर्दू आए लेकिन कभी-कभी कोड स्विच करने में टाइम लगता है. But for the most part, my Urdu is good.
What do you do, by the way?
So I'm a microbiologist by education. I went to undergrad. I studied microbiology. I have my degree in microbiology, but I never worked in it. I was in a co-op program in university, which means that I alternated my study terms with work terms. And all my work terms, my jobs were in the education field. I started university the year after the recession, like the big recession of like the 2000s. So there were not a lot of co-op jobs available when I was looking for work. So a lot of the jobs that were available were in education. So I ended up working at universities. And then for my very last co-op, I ended up going to Singapore for 1 year. I worked at the National University of Singapore for 8 months. And I kind of traveled around in Asia. So when I came back and I graduated with an undergrad degree in microbiology, I realized I didn't really want to work in that field. I had more experience in education. So I ended up going into online teaching. So I taught English online for 6 years. I worked at a startup in San Francisco, and most of my students were from Europe and South America because the time zone just ended up working out that way, you know. So I had adults, like men and women in their 40s or 50s, sometimes in their 30s, who were, looking to expand their English skills because they were moving to an English-speaking country, or they wanted to get a better job, or they wanted to travel to English-speaking countries, for a plethora of reasons. I didn't work with children or anything like that.
Yeah.
Like people think I taught
I was picturing kids, yeah.
Actually, the only kids I did work with was in 2017. I got hired by this Danish family, and they flew me out to Denmark to travel with them for the summer to teach their 2 teenage daughters English. So I lived with them and I traveled with them in Asia and Europe for 6 weeks. And I taught their daughters knew English. Their daughters were 14 and 16, but they weren't confident in speaking. So I was kind of there to encourage them to speak English.
And they flew you out there. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. It was like an all-expense paid trip.
Wow.
They paid for all my hotels. They paid for all my travels. They paid for my flights. And it was pretty great. I think that was like the peak, quote unquote, the peak of my profession. And then after that, I was just like, I don't want to work anymore. I have done the most I can do in this field.
Yeah. I'm also just noticing right off the bat, just the first few minutes of recording, you've been mentioning a lot of different places that you've been to. Indonesia, Denmark, Singapore, San Francisco. So it seems like you've been around quite a bit.
Yeah, I have traveled quite a lot, and my family, I've traveled since I was like pretty young. One of my first international trips was to France when I was, I think, 5 or 6 with my family.
Hmm.
And then we used to go to the States almost every year. But when I was a preteen, my mom has like her sisters who lived there.
Mhm.
So my cousins were there. And yeah, I've traveled a lot in Pakistan as well. I've been to like the northern areas. We have a house in Murray, my family
Oh,
and I.
nice. That's really cool.
Yeah, so I've been to like Naran, Kahan,
Yeah,
Shogran, like Hunza, Gilgit, Baltistan. I've been all over like the
that's
northern
awesome.
region as well. So yeah, so I come from a very like travel happy family.
Oh, yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, not a lot of people can say that, and even the people who live in Pakistan can't say that oftentimes.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. I have when I was there last, people were like, "Oh my God, I went to Hunza with my mom
Mhm.
2 years ago," and people were like, "Oh, I wish I could go there. I've lived in Lahore my whole life and I've never been to Hunza." So
Right.
yeah, it's true.
Okay, did you catch all 8 places that Hina mentioned? Here's the answer: Indonesia, Singapore, San Francisco, Denmark, France, Naran Kagan, Murray, Toronto, and as a bonus, outside of this recording, she mentioned she lived in New York as well for a few months. So at this point, we begin the main story. Hina is here to tell us her life story, especially a major part of her life that involves marriage. Hina had a very untraditional marriage because she did not get married to a Pakistani man or a Muslim man, as most Pakistani girls often do. She married an Indian Hindu man named Sai, who she met nearly 10 years ago. In the rest of this episode, Hina tells us the story of how she met Sai, how they began dating, and how the relationship progressed, how her family reacted to her decisions, what it's like to be in an interreligious marriage, and many other side topics along the way. Let's get started. So you moved to Canada when you were 17,
Mhm.
and I think according to your story around that, in Canada sometime you met your now husband Sai, right?
Yeah, I met him in undergrad when I was, so we both went to the University of Waterloo,
Mhm.
which is about an hour away from Mississauga, which is where I live. So I moved to Waterloo, like I moved to the city. I moved out of my parents' house when I went to undergrad. And Sai he's Indian, but he grew up and lived all his life in Dubai.
Hmm.
And he was an international student. And we met when I was at the end of my third year and he was at the end of his second year. So he's a year younger than I am. I was turning 23. So we met in December during exam time. So this is December 2010. And we met at a coffee shop. It was exam time. And somebody I went to high school with was at this coffee shop on campus. And so I went there and he was sitting there with this guy I didn't know. And so this guy's name is Sid.
Mhm.
He and I went to high school together. And so he waves over at me and he's like, "Hey," and I'm like, "Hey." So I go over to his table and he introduces me to his roommate, Sai. He's like, "Oh, this is my roommate." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And so we all kind of sat down on the table together. So it was me, Sid, Sai, and he was studying for one of his exams. And I don't know, they were just like this electrifying connection, as people say. It was, I feel like it was so intense. Sid, like our friend, he's like, "Okay, I'm just gonna go." He sat with us for like 15-20 minutes and he could kind of tell that
Mhm.
like Sai and I were, we were connecting, and he's like, "I'm just gonna go." And he left and Sai and we just kind of sat there. It was a coffee shop, so we chatted. And I was about to leave for Singapore. I was 3 weeks away from going to Singapore for my internship.
Right.
And I was newly single, so I had just come out of like a 2-year relationship.
Mhm.
So I was dating this Pakistani Muslim guy for like my first 2 years of undergrad. No, my second and third year of undergrad.
Mhm.
I was with this Pakistani Muslim guy, and then we broke up in the fall of 2010. And then I was like the single lady. And then I got this job in Singapore. And then in December, 3 weeks before I was about to leave, I met Sai at that coffee shop. Even though we both knew we had this connection, I was like, "Listen, bro, I'm going to Singapore. I just got out of a relationship. I am like not at all interested in dating anybody.
Mhm.
I'm going to go to Singapore. I'm going to have like a ton of fun and, have a happy life."
Mhm.
And we kind of stayed connected on Facebook. But I think the defining moment was the day of my flight to Singapore. I got a text from Sai And he texted me. He's like, "Hey, it was so great meeting you. You're really cool. And when you come back from Singapore, you should be my girlfriend." And I replied back, like, I think something like "LOL, haha, we'll see," And then I left, and I was in Singapore for 8 months. I traveled a bunch. I actually dated somebody while I was there as well. And then when I came back,
How long were you in Singapore? Like a few months, right?
8 months.
8 months.
8 months. 8 months. Yeah, I was there from January till August to 2011. And then when I came back, Sai and I started dating around September of 2011.
Okay. And I guess for context now, it'll help to talk a little bit about your family. Are you an only child?
No, so I am the eldest in my family of 3 kids. So it's me, and then I have a brother. He's a year younger than I am. And then we have a sister. She is 10 years younger than I am.
Okay.
She was born when my dad was like 40. So no, I'm the eldest.
I know. I was born when my dad was 50. So I have.
So
Yeah, I got you beat. Yeah. Pakistanis and Desis in general are not orthodox. Oftentimes, our families are different.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think my parents were planning on having another kid. It just kind of sort of happened.
Right.
Yeah.
So how would you say your household was at the time? Meaning, how religious are your parents? And just tell us a little bit more about them. So help us understand kind of the struggle that was going to come soon after you met Sai.
I feel like my family I'd be dishonest if I was like, oh my God, Islam was it was such a huge issue. And my family was always very, Muslims, we're Muslims, you should be proud of Muslims. Yeah. Marrying a Muslim is, the right thing to do. But my parents were also very like, you can marry anybody off the book, like you can marry like a Christian, or you could in essence marry like a Jew as well, But I think that was as far as my parents sort of, their sphere of, like what's acceptable, it kind of grew. Plus I have, I had an aunt who was married and divorced like 3-4 different times, and she married like white guys after her first husband was Pakistani, so it wasn't like unheard of in my family that people married outside of the culture, but nobody really married outside of the religion. Like my aunt, she was always like, yeah, I married white guys, but they all converted to Islam before they married me, so it was kind of like that. So my family, it wasn't really, we weren't very like religious, like nobody wears hijab in my family. It was a typical, my father and my brother would go to Jummah prayers, and no real prayers were offered any other times of the week. And Ramzan was a big thing, we fasted, but fasts were kind of like, you're fasting and when you're home from school, you're just sleeping till you wait for iftari, and then you just eat like a fuck ton of food. So it wasn't really, I wouldn't say that we were like very strict, but it was like, we're Muslims and we should be proud of it, and we should at least try to follow the
basics.
The basics, exactly. Like Jummah prayer is like a basic. Okay, gotta do that. Like don't eat pork. That's like a basic. You gotta do that. So the things like that.
Yeah. So what about Sai and his family? Tell us a little bit about them. Meaning, he is Hindu, right?
He is a Hindu, yeah. His parents and him, he was born in Bombay, but he moved to Dubai when he was like 8 months old or something with his family. He's an only child, and his parents he tells me about how when he was like a teenager, they had like these bhajans in their house, and, like people would come over and they'd be like an idol, and people would be, like worshipping and singing and around it. And they had like a guru. So Hindus believe in like the guru, right? There's like a family guru who like guides them. So his family had that, and they would like, he'd come over from India every year and stay with Sai and his family. And Sai, he considers himself an atheist. He's like, even when we met, he's like, I'm an atheist, but and like, she's like, I'm like, yeah, but you're Hindu, right? You can't be like nothing. You have to be something, right? The concept of atheism was still very like novice, I suppose, like still novel idea to me.
Yeah.
So he says he's been an atheist since he was like 15, 16, since after he read Atlas Shrugged. I don't know if you know about that book.
I've heard of that.
So he considers that book to be like his awakening. So he wasn't very, like, he didn't wear any of like the rings or, like any of the symbolism of outwardly being Hindu. He doesn't wear any of that. He doesn't really practice. But his family, you know, he grew up eating no beef, for example. He's like, the first time I ate beef was when I came to Canada, because beef to Hindus is like what pork is to Muslims, right?
Right.
So he's like, I ate beef when I came here. And like, he didn't tell his family that he ate beef, you know, like he drank alcohol when he came to Canada. He didn't tell his family that his father didn't drink, you know? So, so I think he was like the Hindu version of what my family was being Muslim, you know, like, in the sense where so you have the basics and you follow the basics,
Right.
and you try to stick with your religion wherever you can, you know, got to do the basics. His family was like that as well.
Yeah, yeah.
But with Hinduism.
Yeah, so then how did this story start coming together? Meaning in 2011, you said you came back from Singapore and then you started, you basically joined back with Sai. At what point did it become more serious, do you think?
So we started dating in 2011 and we moved in together in 2012, exactly a year after we started dating. But I should mention that when I met Sai in 2010, I had a very strong like physical attraction to him, but I was like, oh, you're off limits because you're a Hindu. Like I definitely had that. Like I would be lying if I said I was above that. I was like, no, you know, I find you attractive. You're a good looking guy. You know, like we clearly have a connection. We have chemistry. You make me laugh, but you're a Hindu, you know? And so it's like distance. And plus I'm going to Singapore, so this is not going to happen. So, you know, bye. But when I went to Singapore, I dated an Indian Hindu while I was there. And it just happened that like my group of friends in Singapore, they were Indians because I lived in Indonesia. A lot of them ended up graduating from Indonesia and going to Singapore for undergrad. So a lot of them were there. And so this guy who I ended up dating in Singapore, he was like a friend of a friend, and he was like an Indian Hindu. And because I was in Singapore, I was like, nobody's gonna know that I'm doing this. I can totally date an Indian Hindu, you know, like oh, so my parents aren't here. Like I can do whatever the fuck I want, you know. And I ended up dating him for 6 months, and I realized how well I mashed with him in the sense that all his friends were also, you know, they were like Indian Hindus like him. And so a little bit of context, I said earlier that I dated a Muslim Pakistani for 2 years. I had 2 years in my head of, you know, what being with a Muslim Pakistani was going to be like for me. So, and again, I just want to say to your listeners, I'm not generalizing here as to that all Pakistani men are this way or that way. I'm just saying that this was my experience, you know? Right. Yeah. So the guy who I dated who was Pakistani, he was like perfect for my parents. You know, he was fair skinned. He was studying to be a doctor. His father was a doctor. He was from Lahore defense, just like my family was, you know, and my family, like they knew I was dating him when I was an undergrad, and they had like, it was as though they had given me the seal of approval, you know, like he would come to barbecues at my house and, you know, we were dating. We weren't like married or anything. And my parents were like, no, this is a great guy. Totally, you can marry him. You can date him. It's totally okay. He checks all the boxes. But, you know, he was very, him and his friends, I don't even know how to explain it without sounding, you know, like mean or, you know, they were studying to be doctors. Not because they wanted to be doctors, but because their parents wanted them to be doctors. And they didn't really want to be doctors, you know, and they were like, oh man, they used to cheat on all their examinations.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And like the guy I dated, he didn't get high, but his best friends, his two best friends who were also Pakistani Muslims, they would get high all the time, but they didn't drink. They didn't eat non-halal meat. And I always ask them about it. They're like, oh, you know, in the Quran, it doesn't say like it's ambiguous as to weed, you know. So
there's some loopholes.
Exactly. So they're like, because there's a loophole, we can do it. But no alcohol, no halal meat, no sex. But they would like, they kind of dated girls. And then they would all kind of talk about how the girls they were dating were hoes because they were dating them. You know? It was like, you know, so I got like a very, very intimate look into the life of a specific kind of Pakistani man and his group of friends, you know? And that was part of the reasons why we broke up. I'm like, I'm not gonna live like this with you, you know? Like, you don't have the kind of balls to stand up to your dad and tell him that you don't want to be a doctor. Like, what kind of a life are you? Like, I don't want to, you know, I don't want to be with no doormat, you know, I don't want to be with like no man who's like, you know, whipped by his parents. Like, I don't want to be with someone like that. So when I moved to Singapore, that was the kind of man and relationship that I was kind of coming from, you know? So when I was dating this guy in Singapore, you know, Indian Hindus are different from Pakistani Muslims. I know that like, of course, given they're different, but the men, again, I'm not generalizing. I'm not saying all Indian guys are like this, but in my experience, the younger ones, millennials, people of my age, they were way more like chill. They had way more chill. Like they were like not so much in denial. Like the guy who I was with, he's like, yeah, no, my family's Hindu and, you know, we're not supposed to eat beef, but I do. And they know it, and that's okay. And I'd be like, whoa, good for you, man. You know, good for you for being true to yourself and not living in denial, you know?
Yeah.
And all his friends were like that as well. And they treated their girlfriends with like a lot of respect. You know, they didn't like, when he was together with his guy friends, they didn't talk shit about the girls that they were dating, and, you know, as though the girls were hoes, you know? Yeah. And it was like, I was exposed to this like whole other, because I have to say this, I cannot date or be with a white guy. I'm just one of those people, like, I need to be with the desi, you know? I love our language. I love our food. I love our culture. And I cannot be with somebody who doesn't get that.
Doesn't understand, you know? That, yeah, right.
And I know that, you know, there's white guys who learn Urdu for the person that they're dating or they're married to, or they, you know, they convert to Islam for them, whatever. Yeah. I know that there are white guys who do that, but I need somebody who grew up with the same things that value, like the music. Right. I love old Bollywood music. I love like old Bollywood music from the 60s and 70s and old Pakistani music. I love Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, you know? Yeah. I need somebody who
can appreciate all of that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So for me, I realized that, oh my God, Indian guys are the answer. And it's not like I went out like, okay, now I'm only going to date an Indian guy, you know, but having distance from my family, having distance, you know, having come out of like a relationship with a Muslim Pakistani and then dating this Indian Hindu guy who was like, wow, like this guy, it's so great. Like, I don't have any of the like, I could wear whatever I wanted. There was no like, oh, if you wear shorts, you're a slut, you know, like there was the Pakistani guy I dated. He was like, shorts, sleeveless, you know, like, you know, buri aurtein, like, you know, the wrong kind of women wear stuff like that. And this guy was like my age. I'm not talking about some fucking uncle. I'm talking about somebody my age, you know? So, but the other, like, the Indian Hindu guys, they were not like that. They're like, yeah, it's fucking hot in Singapore, man. Like, why are you not wearing shorts? And I was like, oh, wow. You know? So I have to say that dating that guy, but, you know, I was there for, I knew that it wasn't going to be like, oh, I am, you know,
permanent
when
thing.
I was dating. Exactly. It was like, I'm here, I'm in Singapore, I'm exploring, you know, and it was the same for him as well. He's like, oh, you're here, you know, let's have fun. You know, you're cool. We get along well together, you know, and it was great. He came to drop me off at the airport when I was coming back to Canada, you know, so yeah. I had such a great, it was like an eye-opening experience. So when I came back to Canada after my time in Singapore, that issue that I had with Sai is like, no, you're off limits because you're a Hindu. That was gone. Yeah. You know?
Mindset was gone. Yeah.
Exactly. Because it was like, you know, if anything, I'm more inclined to date you because from what I've seen from my recent experience, it's more likely that you're going to be more open-minded about certain things that matter to me, you know, like everybody has, you know, limitations and whatever, but things that matter to me, it's more likely that you'll be open-minded about those things. And so when we started dating, that was the case, you know, like, I'm sorry to your listeners if this is like too much information, but the Muslim Pakistani guy I dated, right? Well, I mean, he was all like, no sex till marriage. Okay. I was like, okay, fine. Right. You know, it was never really an issue for me. I was a virgin, you know, when I started dating him, but then, you know, we ended up having sex, I think a couple of months after we started dating, and he would always feel so guilty. Oh my God. Like post sex was just like, it's okay. You didn't do anything bad.
You're talking about the Pakistani guy?
Yeah, the Pakistani guy. Okay. It would be like, post-sex would be like, you didn't do anything wrong. It's okay. God's not going to send you to hell. You know, like he would have this like existential crisis every single time, you know? And I was like, oh my fucking, it was like mommying him almost. You know, so that wasn't an issue with with Sai, for example, he was like, oh, he's like, I don't think you're a slut because you've had sex, like that's okay, I would hope so. He's like, I don't want no virgin. It's like, different people have different, different priorities.
Yeah.
So that was like a relief for me to kind of be like, yeah, he is open-minded and he has chill, and he's not in denial about who he is and what he does and how he lives and why he lives the way he lives. He wasn't in denial about those things. And that was a huge plus for me, coming from, again, the Pakistani Muslim relationship where everything was like, oh no, God loves you. And no, you're doing the right thing by being subservient to your father. It was like, I didn't want that.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of, in my university, when I was going to school over here, there were a lot of Pakistani guys dating Indian Hindu girls. But then there was always, I don't know if there was always this expectation between them or this understanding that eventually they will break up because there's no way they can actually get married. It seemed like they kind of knew it was never a permanent thing.
No, absolutely. I knew guys like that in undergrad as well. They're actually a very good friend of ours who recently got married. When he was in undergrad with us, he's an Indian Hindu. He was dating a Pakistani Muslim girl, and he was like, when it was time for him to get married, he married an Indian Hindu.
Yeah, right.
So absolutely, it's
the majority of those end up that way.
Absolutely. I think a lot of them see it as I'm going to have to do what my parents want. So while I'm in undergrad, I might as well do what I want because after that, I'm just going to, be like whipped by my parents. Parents play a huge role. Absolutely. So I knew that I didn't want to be with someone who was like shit scared of his dad, and who was like, oh no, mommy, daddy, what they say is like Bhagwan ka, like it's like written in stone what mommy, daddy want. I was like, I knew I didn't want to be with someone like that.
That's not going to, work for you.
No, yeah. So we started dating in 2011. I kept it on the DL, that I was dating him. It wasn't like a big deal. My parents knew that, I dated. They weren't there in Singapore, so they don't know what I did there, right?
Yeah.
So when I came back, I dated Sai. I lived on my own, you
had moved out basically.
I was in university. I paid my own bills. I was financially independent. I had co-op jobs. I wasn't really like my parents were withholding finances from me unless I, lay bare my life to them. That wasn't the relationship I had with my parents, So I could pretty much do whatever I wanted and they wouldn't know unless I told them, So I dated Sai for about a year before it was like, I think my mom knew that I was dating somebody, but she didn't really ask, She was like, oh, maybe when I'm ready, I'll tell her. She knew about Sai. She knew I had this guy friend named Sai, but she didn't know that I was dating him. And then a year later, we were moving in together. So this is fall 2012. And that's when like shit kind of started hitting the fan. It was like, moving in with a guy without marriage, that was like, what are you doing? And on
Next
top of
level.
that, and what are you? And on top of that, he's like he's like a non-Muslim, like a Hindu, Indian, and of course, Sai, he's darker skinned. I'm very fair, so my mom's like, and he's a Kala, So it's like everything you can throw at him. It was like, and I was like, yeah, okay. And she was like, I have to admit, she was like quite hateful. And she was quite harsh with her words. But I was like, too bad. Too bad. That's the way you feel. Yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. Like I don't have anything to prove to you, That was another thing. I was never really like, oh, I have met so many Pakistanis who say these things, and for me, it's such a massive eye roll. It's like, my parents have done so much for me. They fed me, they sent me to school, and they paid for me. And it's like, yeah, well, what the fuck did you expect? And when you have a baby, those are like the basics I suppose you're supposed to do, So I never had that sense towards my parents. I love my parents and I respect them, but I always was like, their biases and their prejudices are their own. Like, those are not mine. Like, I don't have, because Sai's a Hindu or he's an Indian, I don't have the same view of him that my mother does. And her view of him is her problem. That's not my problem.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really doing anything wrong, you know. They sometimes make it seem like you're like committing murder, you know, and it's not really that bad. I'm not hurting anybody, you know. This is my life and I'm doing what I feel is right. I'm being true to myself. I'm following my mind and my spirit, what my heart says, and I'm not like asking you for anything, you know. I'm not asking you to fund my romance with Sai, you know. I'm not asking you for any of that. I'm asking you to just have an open mind, you know. And if you can't do that, that's your problem. You know. So that's the way I always kind of approached things. Yeah.
Right. So did their mindset kind of change over time?
So I think I should mention at this point, I do have a father, even though I haven't spoken about him. So my dad, he was a troubled guy on his own. You know, that's like a whole other podcast. Mm-hmm. But my parents were separated at the time that I was dating Sai. And, you know, my dad, I suppose he heard from the grapevine, and I never really knew how he felt about it or what he thought. But he called me a grand total of, I think, one time, telling me that he knew that I was dating that Hindu. And I was like, okay, well, thanks for calling Dad.
And that's it? That's all he said?
That's it. That's it. And so it's mostly my mom, you know, like my mom and my mom was also very concerned. So at this time, my sister is like 16, you know, so my mom is very concerned with what kind of standard I'm setting for my sister. What's she going to think, you know, like her older sister moved in with this guy who was not even a Muslim and they're not married, blah, blah, blah. So my mom had like that also kind of in the back of her mind that she has to protect my younger sister from my devil influence, you know?
Yeah.
But I was like, yo, man, you guys do you. This is my life. I'm not doing anything wrong. I have a clear conscience. Like, I go to bed just fine at night, you know? I'm not up at night.
They didn't keep you up at night.
No, I'm not like, oh my God, my mom, is she heartbroken? Is she okay with my decision? I'd be like, man, this is like her issue. She needs to sort it out, you know? So.
And what about your brother? Were you fairly close to your siblings?
My brother and I, we were very, very close when we were younger. But, you know, just as you grow older...
You get distant sometimes, yeah.
You know, different genders. Yeah. Also, I moved out of our house when I moved to university. My brother didn't. He went to college. He stayed at home. You know, he didn't leave. He didn't move out of like my mom's house till he was like in his mid-20s, you know. So it's a different kind of a dynamic. Plus my brother, he was like the only male in the family. And then with like a dad who was like half present, half absent, had his own issues, you know. And like my dad was an alcoholic, you know. So he died in an accident when I was 25, you know. So my brother, he had like different sort of priorities. His priorities were not rebelling and, you know, going for what he wants. It was like, there's nobody supporting our mother. I need to be here for her, you know. So he wasn't really like, Hina, what you're doing is bad or wrong. He was just like, hey, you know, if this is what you want to do, this is what you want to do, that's fine, you know. But he wasn't like, I support you or I'm against you. His priority was like...
He was kind of neutral on this. His priorities were different.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, my brother, he's a middle child, and that's like the most prominent trait of a middle child. They're diplomatic, and my brother fits that to a T.
Makes sense, yeah.
So when we moved in together, that was like, that was like a thing. But we went ahead, we did it anyways, you know, we moved in. And then in January 2013, we moved to San Francisco, Sai and I, from Waterloo, Canada. And that was another thing. It's like, you're going with that Hindu to San Francisco. Yeah. And so I just lived my life, you know, the way that I wanted. And of course, my mother had opinions. Of course, she said nasty things, but there was nothing really she could threaten me with. You know, she could threaten me with like the silent treatment, you know, like she wouldn't talk to me.
And you had already moved out, right? Prior to meeting Sai.
Yeah.
At what point did you move out and not move back in with your parents?
I was 19. I was 19 when I moved out of my parents' house.
So you had moved out at a very young age. You established your independence at that point in time. So that's why you kind of didn't really rely on her to...
No, I didn't really need like their money or their permission for anything. You know, I worked when I was in high school. I worked throughout undergrad. I would have like my first year of undergrad, I had 2 jobs. Like I would work during the day at a bookstore, and then I had classes. And then in the evening, on the weekends, I would work at this pita place making pitas for like drunk students as they're stumbling out of like, bars and stuff. So I always knew that if I wanted to do what I wanted to do, I had to be financially independent to do it.
Right.
I took student loans to help me pay for my studies. My parents could absolutely afford it, absolutely. My dad even tried to tempt me. He was like, if you stay home and go to a close by university, I will pay your fees and buy you a smart car.
Wow.
And I was like, Dad, trust me, that is so, because, back then smart car was like all the rage. It was like everybody wanted a smart car. I was like, I want a smart car. But I had to resist the temptation. I was like, nope, that's okay. Thanks for the offer, Dad.
Right.
So
The trap.
yeah, the trap. That was the first step. You got to escape that trap. So I slummed it out, as I like to say, so I could have my independence, and I did. So I moved to San Francisco in January 2013. Sai was working there. He's a software engineer, by the way.
Yeah.
And he was working there for a startup. That's when I started doing the online English teaching as well. So I was working online, teaching English. He was at a startup doing a co-op job. And then my dad died in May that year. So he died in an accident. And so we had to come back. He died in Canada, but then his family, like his brothers who live in Pakistan, they wanted his body kind of like sent back to Pakistan so they could bury. They have like a family burial plot in Lahore. So they wanted his body buried there, So it was like it was not like the easiest, like his death and everything to do. So my brother and my mom took his body to Pakistan so they could bury him there. And then I had to come back. I stayed with my sister. My sister was like 16 at this time. She was like 16 years old, So I stayed with her at our house. My brother and my mom were gone for 5 weeks. How when somebody dies unexpectedly, there's just so much, like financially, emotionally, burial, then you have to, like all the religious stuff and family, and, so.
That's a lot, yeah.
It's a lot. And then my parents were separated when he died, so there was also like that animosity between my mom and her, my father's family. So it was a shit show. Yeah. So Sai and I, we came back in May of 2013 after my dad died. And then my mom and my brother were gone to Pakistan for 5-6 weeks. I was with my sister and Sai in our house. And then when my mom came back, I'm sure it wouldn't have been easy for her, like having to deal with like my dad's death and funeral and his family when she was like getting a divorce from him. And then on top of that, her daughter's like living her life philandering about with like a Hindu, So she came back like extra vicious, like it was unbearable, I would say. And that's when I was like, I can't be involved in your life if this is the way you're going to treat me and my choices. And, like the lack of compassion or empathy towards me from her, I was really saddened by that. It really hurt me. It really did. And I was like, I can't, like, you're in a bad place, and I understand that, but I don't deserve the toxic, the hateful emotion that you're directing at me. I don't deserve this, And that's when I was like, I can't deal with this anymore. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to see you. I'm sorry, and that's it. I didn't talk to my mom for a whole year.
Oh, wow.
A whole year. There was no contact between her and I. I didn't see her. I didn't call her. I didn't message her. She didn't call me. She didn't see me.
And you were still in San Francisco at that time?
No. So we had come back. We had come back in May, and then Sai got a job in Toronto. And then so we were in Toronto for that year.
I see.
2014. Yes. 2014 is when Sai and I moved to Ottawa. So we were in Toronto for a year. So 2013, January till April, we're in San Francisco. May we come back to Toronto. We're in Toronto till the following year. I don't talk to my mom, no contact between her and I, none of that. And then in the summer, there's like a little bit of a contact, there's kind of like birthdays coming up, like my birthday's in March, for example. So it was kind of like happy birthday. She just sends me a text. Her birthday's in April. So I just like happy birthday, send her a text, just kind of like just starting to trickle in. And then in the summer, there was like more of a conversation. My sister came to visit me. She stayed with me. In summer of 2014, I gave my mother mushrooms.
Mushrooms.
Mushrooms, like magic mushrooms.
really?
Yeah. So she and I, we were, just on. She was going to Pakistan again for like the second time since my dad's death.
Mm-hmm.
And she never went to Pakistan that often. And I was like, what? Like, why are you going? That's kind of why we reestablished contact as well. She messaged me. She's like, hey, I'm going to Pakistan. My mom she's always been like this. She's like, if I die on the plane, she's always been like this. So she's like, if something happens while I'm gone, like you're the eldest in the family, you have to, watch out for your sister and your brother, blah, blah, blah. Right. Yeah. So that's kind of like when contact was sort of reestablished. And so I went to see her at her house, and it was like very like formal and kind of cold, and I told her to trust me, and if she trusted me, I wanted her to have an experience, and she's like she's kind of hesitant. She's like, okay, I trust you. And I gave her mushrooms.
Yeah, and she took them.
And I told her what they were. I'm like, these are mushrooms,
right.
Yeah, I'm like, she took them. Like, I put them in. I didn't like drug her when she was sleeping or anything. It was like we were awake. It was during the day.
And this was just to kind of help her with her anxiety, or you just wanted to?
It was to help her and to help me. To be honest, I had taken mushrooms before, and I knew like how they worked and what they were capable of. So I gave her like a very little, like a low dose. I didn't give her enough to like trip her to like another dimension. She took them, and then we had like one of, I would say, the first real heart-to-hearts that I've ever had with my mother. She talked about like her whole life, like before meeting my dad and after getting married, and what kind of a marriage they had, and all the ways that she was hurting and all the disappointments and sadness of her life, not just because of my dad, because of her own family, her own father, her own siblings and all that stuff, and how she had been carrying so much of that around. And I knew, on some level I knew that that's what was happening, but I didn't think that I was, again, the sacrificial. My mother, she's in so much pain. Yes, mom, you can hurt me till like there's nothing left in me. I was not like that. I'm like, you're hurting, and I understand that, but I don't deserve like, I'm not the
punching bag,
the object of your anger. Exactly. I'm not your punching bag, So that trip of mushrooms with her, that opened up a lot of parts of her mind and her, spirit, I would say. And she, she's like, I don't have a problem with Sai. This is all, she's high right now. By the way. She's tripping. She's like, I don't have a problem with Sai. I know you love him. I know, he's a good guy. He's a good man. And I know he treats you well. You've been with him, and I trust your judgment. But you have to understand, what it's like when your eldest daughter does this in our community, in our culture, what it's like. She's like, you don't think my mom, so now my mother is saying that my grandmother called my mother and was like, I know your daughter is doing blah, 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 blah. The family network, Right. So for my mom, she was like, you don't know, what I had to hear. And I'm like, I understand, I fully understand what you had to go through. I'm not saying it's easy,
And your grandma was still back in Pakistan?
Yeah, my grandmother's back in Pakistan. I have aunts in like the US who are like, one of them is like, Hina's been a Hindu. Like, not the one who's married 4 times, not her, the other one. The one who's married 4 times, she's pretty chill. She's like, oh man, I fucking love Sai. He's a great guy, And so my khalas, right. So one of my khalas is like, oh, what Anila, my mother's name is Anila. What Anila's beti is doing? Anila ki beti, wo Hindu den all rendi hai, like, so my mom, she was like, she had to like hear that from her family, and then she had to hear shit from my father, which was like, oh, your daughter this and your daughter that, and you raised a slut daughter, blah blah blah, So my mom, she opened up about how it was hard for her to deal with that from all sides. And and I empathize. I fully I said I know it would have been hard. Thank you, A, for dealing with that, and B, who do you care about more? Do you care about what these people think, or do you care about like my happiness? And she's like, I care about your happiness, and I'm like, then I'm happy. Then you should know that I'm very happy, So that trip that she took, I didn't take mushrooms. I gave them to her. I wanted to be sober for her. That really deepened our connection on a lot of levels, our understanding of each other, of our life, my understanding of her life and her understanding of my life. And, we connected not just as mother and daughter, but as woman to woman,
So prior to this, you didn't really have that kind of heart-to-heart discussion?
No. I had moved out for university, and then my parents, I was very reluctant to get involved with my mom and my dad, and they're I was oh my god, their marriage has been this my whole life, I'm so fucking done with this shit, I just want to move the fuck on, so after my dad died, and after all of that kind of the trauma of that settled, and it was established that I was not going to cave into what my mother wanted me to do. I wasn't going to leave Sai because she was unhappy. After all that had passed, then we had this heart to heart, and it was now we're on the same plane of understanding. Let's just say,
I see.
So that was a big breakthrough moment, I would say. So people, whoever's listening, I don't recommend you give your parents mushrooms to get them on board. I'm just saying, FYI, this is my story. This is what I did. This is what I had to do. This is my life choices. FYI, don't do drugs, kids.
Of course. but it worked for you. So that's what I find so interesting about it.
Absolutely, it did.
Yeah, I think anybody else might have 1,000 other types of scenarios play out if they gave their parents mushrooms.
Absolutely. And I always tell people this, if your father is a mullah in your mosque, I would not recommend you do these things. I would not say that your chances of being with the Hindu are very high, they're not. If your mom wears a full face niqab or a burqa and she prays 5 times a day, and the chances that you're going to be able to get away with the things that I got away with, I would say nil to minimum, you know?
My parents are fairly religious, but they're not super religious, but enough that they pray 5 times a day. And then my older brother, got married to a white American of Jewish background woman, and she converted to Islam. And even after her conversion to Islam, it took maybe 2 years of fighting and crying and convincing my parents for my brother to get her to do that. So it's much more difficult for other people, I think.
Yeah, and of course I had that. I could have been hey, Sai, let's spare both of us a whole bunch of misery and you just convert to Islam, I always felt that. Again, this is my personal opinion, people. Whatever you do with your own lives is your own choice. I personally always felt that was a cop-out, and it was a dishonest thing to ask anybody you love to do. I've always felt that way. I could have been like that. I'm hey, Sai, my mom would be so much happier if you just said the first kalma and you went to the mosque and got yourself a Muslim baptism. She'd be so happy. But I didn't want to ask him to do that because I didn't care. It didn't matter to me whether he was Muslim or not. And I didn't want to have to ask him to do something that I myself didn't care about. And also, what if his parents wanted me to be Hindu? It's such a one-way thing. It's no. What your parents want doesn't matter. What my mom wants is more important, And I never asked him, and I never wanted him to be oh, I can be Muslim. He never offered. But if I had asked him, I know he would have done it. And I know that deep down, he wouldn't really have wanted to. And that is not the way I wanted to start our life together. Hey, you're doing something dishonest as the first big gesture of our life together. That's not what I wanted.
It would just be putting a curtain of denial again over the truth.
Exactly. Exactly. It's okay, you said this, but back home, when we're in our house, we eat pork and we eat everything and we do whatever. But when we're with
in your heart, you don't really believe it. Yeah. But you're just doing it for show. That doesn't make sense.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's I can't live my life like that. I can't live my life with the person I live with my family. The amount of cognitive dissonance you have to live your life like that. I have way better things to do with my time than to jump through those mental loopholes every day,
Right. Do you consider yourself Muslim though, or do you still go by Muslim, or how do you?
That's a very interesting question, to be honest. I consider myself an atheist, but I would not consider myself one of the Richard Dawkins atheists. I believe that there is,
A deity.
for lack of a better word, there's a God, but I don't believe in the Abrahamic God. Like, I don't believe in like this man in the sky who's looking down and judging everybody. I don't believe in that. But I believe in karma. I believe in fate. I believe in, that there is a higher power, that we all have purpose. We all have meaning. Our lives are, they're direct. We have morality. Like, I believe all of those things, when I get really scared, sometimes I do sometimes say like, Bismillah, because again, it's the emotion, right? We don't have any other words, right? That's the words that I have, because that's what I grew up with, and it's easier for me to say, Bismillah or Mashallah than to say some things a Christian would say, because that has no connection to my life, so I don't pray, I don't fast. I eat pork. I drink alcohol. I live with the Hindu,
Yeah. Did this decision happen around the same time that you met Sai, or were you always kind of like this?
No, that's another really great story. I had a crisis of faith after my father died.
Yeah.
So when my dad died, I was 25, and we're always told that when someone dies, we should pray for their soul. They're gone to a better place, and we should forgive them, and God has called them back, and all these things that people turn to religion for comfort in times of sadness and sorrow. And I think when my dad died, that was the first time in my life that I turned to religion, and I found nothing. I actually had more questions than answers, I was like, okay, my dad's dead. Like, what does that mean? Like, he has a soul, he has a spirit. Where is his soul, his spirit? Like, is it in hell? Is it in heaven? Is it in purgatory? Like, what does that even mean? Like, should I forgive my dad for everything he did? Like, would God want me to forgive? I mean, I thought God was supposed to be merciful. Why does God need me to forgive my dad? Like, it was like I actually had more questions than answers, and I had a huge crisis of faith when my dad died, and that's when I kind of went down the dark hole of ex-Muslims. Dun dun dun.
I see. Existential crisis. Yeah.
I had a huge existential crisis. Before that, like, I didn't eat pork. I rarely drank alcohol. Those are like the two big Muslim things, right? So I didn't do them. And I would say, yeah, I'm a Muslim, of course I'm a Muslim. I grew up in Pakistan, I'm a Muslim, of course. What else am I going to be, right? But after my dad died, it was like, am I a Muslim? Like, do I believe these things? Like, do I believe in this Abrahamic God? Like, I don't know, I've never really had to turn to my religion before, really, for any sort of comfort or answers before this. And now that I'm turning to it, I am like confused and perplexed and upset. I am not at all comforted by the answers that we are, supposed to just follow. And so, of course, and this is the point where there's like radio silence with my family, so I can't turn to them,
Right.
So I turned to like the ex-Muslim community, and I found so many people there who understood exactly what I was going through, the crisis of faith, so I kind of explored like that side of myself for the next few years, like my Muslimness, and I realized I'm not, if I, that movie Khuda Ke Liye?
Yeah. Right.
That scene where Nasiruddin Shah, he comes at the end and he's like, you're judging this woman by Muslim standards, but her life is not the life of a Muslim. Hence, she is not a Muslim, So you can't judge her based on Muslim law when she is technically not a Muslim.
Right.
That's what I realized was happening with me. I'm like, technically, I'm not a Muslim. If you follow the technicalities, I'm not. I was born into a Muslim family. I followed Muslim rituals when I was growing up.
Yeah.
But really,
You never consciously made the decision.
deep down, no, I'm not a Muslim,
Right.
So I had that realization over the next few years, So people think that my Muslimness is linked to Sai. It's not. I would call myself a Muslim when I was dating with him and living with him all the time. It was like me being a Muslim has nothing to do with him, and him being a Hindu has nothing to do with me. That's like our own thing. But my Muslimness, I had a crisis of faith after my father's death because I needed Islam, and I feel like Islam wasn't there for me. Maybe I didn't know enough about it, and I'm fully open to that. That like maybe I was the one who was ignorant. Maybe I didn't really know our religion
Learn enough
well
about
enough
it,
to use it properly. I understand that argument as well. But if I were to, no, I'm really not a Muslim, So I had that realization, and I'm comfortable with that realization. And my mom knows that now as well, that I don't really consider myself a Muslim, And she's like, it's been like 10 years now, so she knows all these things. So,
And for the listeners, I think this will be really interesting because when I interviewed Ali, I remember him specifically saying what are some things that really bothered him about Islam. One of the things he mentioned, for example, is why do people suffer, right? Like basic questions. Why does God allow babies to die and things like that? So were those the types of questions that were crossing your mind as well? What were the top things that were disturbing you about Islam?
I think it was more really the whole concept of afterlife and death. Like I said, my father's death is what prompted this whole journey.
Yeah.
And I just wasn't very comfortable with that, with those ideas that like you die and then there's like some other planet, dimension, plane, sky that you go to and then you live there forever. But what is forever? Like how can you live forever? Like, wouldn't you get bored? Like so the whole, I know the concept of an afterlife is meant to comfort us. Like, when you die, you're not really dead. But it didn't comfort me at all. I was really confused and I was kind of upset. I was like, I don't want to live forever in some alternate dimension drinking milk for the rest of my life. Like, what
you
the
just want
fuck?
it to be
Like,
over, right?
I just want it to be over, Or maybe I'd want to come back, I feel like I'm more inclined to believe in the ideas of like nirvana and regeneration and rebirth, which ironically are Hindu ideas, but and they're Buddhist ideas as well. I feel I'm more inclined to deviate in that. I feel like that is more jiving with what I think our soul and our spirit and our consciousness and being here, what it's all about. So I realized when I really looked at what I'm supposed to believe, I didn't really believe any of that. I didn't really think any of that was true or any of that was possible. And my faith I have faith. I believe in the things that you don't understand, that you have to have beyond a certain point. You have to have faith, but I would be acting in bad faith if I said that I believed in the afterlife as presented in the Quran and in Islam and in the Abrahamic religions. I don't. And that kind of opened like the portal to me questioning other things. I wasn't really the kind of person that, why can men have 4 wives? That's like unfair. It's not feminism. Yeah, that's not really what bothered me ever.
See.
I was like, yeah, okay, whatever. It wasn't that.
Yeah, that's very interesting because the majority of people that I would encounter that have a problem with the religion that they're born into, they ask those types of questions. Like why can't women, marry more people, or
no,
why can't women marry outside the religion? Like these specific rules that are very specific to the religion. But that's not your experience.
No, I didn't have questions about the hijab or the oppression. And it's like, I actually didn't have any of those questions. I'm not saying those questions are not valid. Absolutely. If that's like what leads you. Another thing is like, I studied evolution in undergrad. So like I studied microbiology and my specialization was in evolution.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of also was like, okay, evolution, but then what about like Adam and Eve?
Yeah.
And then it's like, then you go down the rabbit hole of Alex Jones. It's like, Jesus was on dinosaurs, So it's like,
Yeah.
So I think that also was kind of like, okay, evolution. I believe in evolution and I believe in Adam and Eve. Do I? I don't know, so I think that was also, that played a part. That didn't really push me into like exploring all of this. But when I got pushed into exploring all of this, like religion and Islam, after my dad's death, then that also absolutely played a role. Like evolution, it's like evolution is a big one. It's like, okay, well, a woman was made from man's rib, and she tempted him and the snake, and then there's only two people in the world, so like everybody, like there's incest, like why, like how does that work? How did we become, like I have so many questions, you know. And I have tried to apply many of stories in the Bible and in the Torah and in the Quran. They're all identical, because it's like, there's maybe like, there's more stories by Prophet Muhammad, of course, in the Quran than the Bible or whatever. And I've tried to apply that sort of thinking to stories of the Prophet in the Quran, that these are metaphorical stories, not literal stories. And I have found them to be like really confusing. It's like, man, I don't know, man. I don't know. Maybe Islam is not a religion that's meant to be seen metaphorically. Maybe it's a more literal religion, So in recent years, I have tried to kind of, I feel like, give Islam a second shot by looking at it through the lens that Jordan Peterson looks at Christianity. And I have not been able to make the jump. It's like, man, I'm more likely that I could be a Christian, but no, it's still not. And my husband is like, man, Hinduism is like, it's fucking crazy. You got like a blue guy flying around, and you got like a monkey god, and like he's like, of course none of that is like Hinduism. It's easier to say that this is not literal, this is metaphorical. I don't think it's easy to say that with Islam, so I feel like in recent years I've tried to have a second look at Islam, and I've still been like, no, can't, sorry.
Not ready for that yet, because I always wonder when there's couples like Shah Rukh Khan, right? So Shah Rukh Khan, his wife is a Hindu, and then I think in one interview he talks about how he raises his kids, and by the way, that's one of the questions that we have for you. But then he talks about, he actually goes by Muslim, right? And then when they talk about raising their kids, they say, well, our kids, they have a room for namaz, and they all have a room for puja as well, and they do both. And I always get confused by that. I always wonder, how can you do both? Because one is literally saying the other isn't true. And that part always confuses me about interreligious marriages, especially when they're not Abrahamic, because there's not that much in common. So I find that quite interesting. So I guess that would also lead up to the question for you guys, since you're...
So I think my husband, having lived in Dubai all his life, he has a very, I would say, I like to use the word appreciation, but it could also be like, let's use the word appreciation. He has a very strong appreciation for Muslim culture, like, because he grew up in Dubai his whole life. Like, he loves Arabic music, like the song Allahi Allah, he loves playing that. Like, I get a little uncomfortable with it's like, man, like, because he's like, this is such a beautiful song, it's like to him, Allah is just a word, it's not, when we hear Allah, it's like, oh my God, like quiver runs through your body. But for him, Allah is just a word, and I think him having been exposed to so much like Muslim rituals, Muslim culture, the language, Arabic, and him actually liking it, I think that absolutely helps our relationship in a lot of ways. And I think the reverse is true for me as well. I grew up watching a fuck ton of Bollywood, so I know more bhajans than he does. It's like that movie, Dil Vil Dhuniya Le Jayenge, when Kajol wakes up one morning and she's like, Om Jai Jagadish Hare. For me, those are just words. It doesn't mean shit. Sometimes I'll sing it and my husband will be like, what the fuck are you saying? Like, it's just a word. Just like he plays the song Allah Allah, and I'm like, what are you doing?
Right.
So I think that sort of yin yang that we both have, where it's like, we don't follow the other's religion, but we fully can appreciate it and understand it, and can be like, this is beautiful, and I want to have this in our life just to enrich our life culturally. I think that's what it is. Neither of us are what I would call believers,
religious, right. But you have a cultural connection to your religions, basically.
Yes, absolutely. We are both, like, he is culturally Indian. I wouldn't even call him culturally Hindu. I am culturally more Muslim than he is culturally Hindu, Like, we have a son now, and...
How old is your son, by the way?
He's 4 months.
Okay. Yeah, very young.
He's very young.
Right.
And when I was pregnant, and it's so interesting. People think that like, oh, the struggle has ended when you've gotten married, But it's like when I got pregnant, it was like, okay, we didn't know whether we were having a boy or a girl. We didn't want to know. We wanted to be surprised. And it was like, it'll be so much easier if it's a girl, because if it's a boy, like, we're going to have to talk about circumcision with my mom.
Oh, yeah.
Because Hindus don't get circumcised, and Muslims have to get circumcised to go to heaven or something like that, right? And it was like, again, if you're circumcised or you believe circumcision is the right thing, that's great. Again, personally, as somebody with a scientific kind of understanding of things, circumcision is not really necessary. Now it's like a religious cultural thing. It's not necessary. My mom's always like, yo, people who are circumcised, they're cleaner. I'm like, yeah, well, maybe like 2,000 years ago when there was no soap and men living in the desert, maybe, they got sick because they weren't circumcised, but that's not the reality we live in now, right? So that was like a whole, every time I'd go visit my mom, she'd be like, so have you thought about what you're going to do if it's a boy? And I'm like, yeah, I have thought about it. And you can like stop asking me what I'm going to do with my son's dick once he's born, So thanks for the interest though. So that was like an interesting thing to get over. Another thing was when I was about 8 months pregnant, my mom and my brother and Sai and I, my husband and I, we went on a picnic together. And my mom was like, oh, Saad's going to be a mamu. And mamu jo hai wo bacche ke kaan mein azan deta hai. And my husband just like looking at me. He doesn't know what any of this means, right? And my mom's like, Saad will give azan. And I'm like, have you decided that Saad will give azan? Because or she's like, no, he should,
Yeah.
And then, so this conversation happened in front of my husband. And then when we went home, I was like, my husband was like, what the fuck was that, right? And I was like, okay, so when the baby is born, Saad is going to go, my brother's name is Saad. Saad is going to go into each ear and give azan in the baby's ear, Right. And my husband was like, I don't want that. I'm like, I don't want that either. But it's that or we have to get a circumcision. So make your choice, sir. He's like, okay, I'll go with the azan thing, because you have to give
Compromise a little bit.
have to give the grandparents some power. With the grandparents, the family members, you have to give them some power. Otherwise, it's like, oh, I value my mother's input about raising a baby so much, and I don't want her to feel like she has no input to give because the things that mattered to her, I completely disregarded them, So the next time we met, I'm like, okay, here's the deal. No circumcision, but you can do the azan. And she took the deal.
And it sounds like your mom hasn't really accepted your position yet, meaning how you feel about Islam. Yeah, maybe it's just her mindset. Like she thinks you'll just come around at some point in time, like ape theek ho jayegi kudi.
It is that. Yes, you're right. It is that.
Mazak kar di pai hai.
Yeah. She's like, you don't know because you're so young and I'm 55 years old and I have lived life and you need God and you need faith and Islam. There's like, she went through like a religious renaissance, not like crazy, but like she tried to fast. She hasn't fasted in like many years. She has like a heart condition, so she didn't really fast. But this year she tried to fast. I think she kept like half of them or just a little under half, So I do think that she feels that I am going quote unquote through a phase, and that ultimately I will need faith and I will need God and I will need religion. But I don't think she understands that I do need those things, but I just don't have the same view of them that she does. Yeah. Like I absolutely need God in my life. I absolutely need faith. I absolutely need to believe in a higher purpose and a higher power. And I do believe in those things. I just don't believe in them in the form that she understands,
Got it.
I don't really try to like get her to see things that way anymore. I'm like, yeah, you're right. A couple of months ago, it was me, her, and the baby, and we were in the car, and we were gonna go on like a 2 or 3 hour drive. And I'm like, Mom, safar ki dua padne. And she's like, and she did. She's like, oh, you're so right. We have a baby in the car. And then she did the safar ki dua, Right. I said that to her because I felt the need to say it too, but I don't know safar ki dua, I was like, okay, we are going on a 3 hour trip in snow with a baby in the back seat. Like, I hope everything is okay. And I'm sending a prayer out into the universe to say, I hope, we have a safe journey. And I turned to my mom and And I wanted her to express that emotion in the language that she knows. So for her, that emotion is safar ki dua. For me, that emotion is saying, please, universe, I hope we have a safe journey. Please keep the baby safe. Thank you. So I absolutely see the value of these things, but the language that I use to express them is different from the language that my mother uses to express them. You're acknowledging the limitations of the control that you have over life and death. So you're acknowledging those limitations that you don't know, you could die, you hope you don't, and you hope that somebody out there is looking out for you and that you're safe. So I feel that all the time, So I just don't like to use the word Allah. I prefer the term, God. I feel like it's more ambiguous. Allah, maybe it's because of the association that I have. And I think Allah, I think of like Islam, and I think of like the way Islam teaches you about God. And I don't agree with that, So I think God is more like a neutral concept for me. So I think of it as God,
Different languages have different words, right? So in this case, it's just But you're right. Yeah, the word Allah is specifically for the God in Islam.
Yes.
I believe, because there's another word for God in Arabic that's not for Allah. Like I think it's just called Ilahi or something.
Yeah, I even sometimes say Yahweh because it's like because I don't have like the religious trauma, quote unquote, with the other religions. So I wouldn't say I'm complete yin yang with my mom about these things, but absolutely that harmony is developing. And with the baby, a lot of it kind of resurfaced. It was like, oh, baby, circumcision, no circumcision, dua, no dua, and then the name, it was like, oh.
And there will be interesting challenges like this all the time, I'm sure. Yeah, this is just the beginning, but it's interesting when you're raising a child and with the situation that you have.
See, that's the thing. For us, it's more like now religion is more like it's a unifying force, not something that causes division. Because for us, we know where we stand. We know what we believe. We know how little religion actually affects our choices. But we know that our families and the people we love, some of the things are important to them. And for us, we want them to feel included in our life and now our son's life. And if some of these things, which really, what do I have to lose if my brother says Azan, my brother's in my son's ear, it makes my mom happy, Right. I'd be unhappy if she like forced me to give my son a circumcision, and I didn't do that because I didn't want to. But these little things, that like if my in-laws want to put like a tika on my son's head, I don't have a problem with that. Go ahead, If you want to put like a kali nazar ka, like the kala thing that they put, sure, go ahead. Am I gonna get his ear pierced and put like an om thing in his ear? Probably not. And if you guys want to know more about some of the things my mom shared when she was on her mushroom trip, I've actually written about that as well. It's a Vice article.
Really?
So
okay,
I can send you the link and I can send you the link and you can, that was actually one of the first things I wrote. And it was hugely popular. I had people from like England and Australia. It's like, oh my God, like you're so great. Your story, your mom's so lucky. I wish I could do that with my mom, and I'm like,
Most people can't.
Thank you, God.
Yeah, there you go. Hina is quite active on the internet, and she's written a few articles sharing her story on her marriage and her relationship with her mom. You can find a few links to those articles on this episode's description or on our website, pakor.com. Once you're on our website, just find the page for this episode and you'll find the links inside.
Thank you so much, Abhi, once again, and we'll be in touch.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, we'll be in touch. Thanks. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye. Thank you.